Hello YouTube, I am Andrew Does Hair. You could find my work on Instagram at Andrew Does Hair. Today in this video, I want to show you 4 different ways that I fade hair. But before we get into techniques, I don't want this to be like a monkey see, monkey do video where you just copy what I do. I want you to understand exactly why you're doing what you're doing and have a bigger picture of what the end goal is supposed to be. So let's talk about what a good fade is before we talk about how to do one. When you look at a good fade, you're really seeing 2 aspects coming together beautifully. The first thing you're looking at is the shade or the blend of the fade, the coloring that it produces. So as hair gets longer, less light is going to pass through the hair to show scalp. And when you can get these lengths to uniformly gradually become longer, you see a smooth gradient from skin to no skin. And so that's one aspect that we're looking at when we look at a fade. The second aspect is the shape of the fade. So ideally, in a perfect world, we have an idea of what a human head is supposed to be shaped like. But in reality, most people have prominent bones here or a dip there. And what can tend to happen is if you're aiming for this perfect shade, you're increasing the length of the hair incrementally as you go up the head, and anywhere the head dips in, it'll catch a shadow, or anywhere the head bumps out, it'll catch a highlight, and you'll get these deviations in your coloring there. And so you're faced with an option here. Do I roll the haircut in with the head, or do I keep the haircut straight and maintain a clean shape? So in a perfect world, if you have a perfect client where his hair is just great, you can have both. You know, when you perfectly shape the fade, you will have perfect shade in the fade, but that rarely happens. Most of the time what happens is somebody has a weird dip and you have to make a decision. Am I going to follow the shape of the head to create no shadow there, or am I going to deviate from the shape of the head to create no dip in the haircut? There are workarounds where you can kind of have the best of both worlds. Sometimes where you have an area that's more dense and so it tends to show less scalp at any given length, you can actually thin out the hair. Or if you have an area where the scalp dips in and catches a shadow, but you don't want to give up that clean shape there, you can actually thin out the hair to let more light through. And so what makes a great fade is not following the steps that I'm going to show you. What makes a great fade is using those steps to pay attention to the shade you're producing and the shape you're producing, and do what you need to do along the way to make sure you have the best of both worlds, to where you can have a perfectly clean, smooth gradient from no hair to hair, and at the same time have a nice, clean, strong silhouette that doesn't wobble in and out along with a wobbly, imperfect head. Fading from the bottom up, take 1. I only have 1 take. Can't put the hair back on the mannequin. All right, so the very first thing you're going to want to do before you fade any hair is flat wrap the hair. If the hair isn't laying uniformly, it's not going to cut uniformly. So I'll put a link in the description to a couple videos about how to flat wrap hair. Let me warn you that as I'm doing all this, I'm trying to reach around without blocking the camera, and it's very hard to do. It's very unnatural for me. So if I look like I'm doing it wrong, that's why. I promise I know how to cut hair. Anyways, this first technique we're going to do is fading the hair from the bottom up, putting in guides and blending out guides. This should be the first way you learn to fade. I didn't learn this first, and I wish I would have, because after I started doing it for a while, fades became a lot easier, because after putting in these guides, it was easier for me to visualize where certain aspects on the fade should fit. So some of the other techniques I'm going to show you I actually learned before I learned how to do this. And after learning to do this, I got better at the other techniques, and so this should be the first way you learn to fade. So what I'm doing here is using my trimmer to put in a bald line. This is actually harder to do on a mannequin than on a human because the ear doesn't move and the skin doesn't move. But basically, if I were to cut this whole head this way, I would put this line all the way around here, and essentially it follows the shape of the parietal ridge, which is the widest part of the head. You can find it by putting your comb on the head and seeing where it comes off the head. So I'm not putting it up to the parietal ridge, I'm just putting it in the shape of the parietal ridge, but pretty low. And as you're learning how to fade, start with everything as low as you can, because as you mess up, the fade creeps up higher. So if you start off trying to do a higher fade and you mess up, you're gonna be stuck. But if you start off low and you mess up, you have room to kind of blend things upward and fix it. Now, I don't perfectly follow the shape of the parietal ridge. I deviate a little bit for various reasons. So in the front here, on most people, this hair is thinner than it is the rest of the way around. And so to create a darker shade here, I'm going to actually leave the hair slightly longer than I would here at the same shade. The reason being, the hair is less dense typically, and so with less density, you need more length to show less skin. So that's why my guideline dips down so much in the front here. I want to leave this kind of heavy and dark. So once I have that first guideline in there, I'm gonna grab my clipper and open the blade all the way, and I'm gonna put in another guideline about 3/4 of an inch above this one. And actually back here, as the hair gets more dense, I'm gonna make this guide a little bit thicker. I should have knocked down this bulk first, but I didn't think it would be that big of a problem. So this is the technique you'll see in 80,000 other YouTube videos about how to do fades. This is pretty much how people fade. You put in a guide, you blend out a guide. You put in a guide, you blend out a guide. So as I'm coming to the top of this section where I'm creating the guide, I'm flicking the clipper off of the head. And that's going to be become kind of muscle memory. You're going to do it without thinking about it. You're always going to be flicking that clipper. But what that does is it just gives you a little bit of flexibility, some forgiveness at the front there. If I just took this straight up and stopped, it would be harder to blend it out. But by flicking it, I'm essentially kind of pre-blending it. So whenever I'm doing a fade, I like to use one of these soft boar bristle brushes to get hair off the scalp, because little hairs sticking to the scalp will look like dark spots. And this next step that I'm going to take here is take out dark spots. So I don't know if this shows up in those cameras, but between the trimmer and this clipper open, there's a bit of a line, the initial line that I put in with the trimmer. And I'm going to blend that out by closing this clipper all the way and then just hitting that line and flicking the clipper off the head. I'm using the corners a lot. I'm not necessarily going to use the entire width of the clipper for most of it. And then after I bump that line up a little more, I'm going to open the clipper just a little, and I'm going to hit the line, again, the slightly higher, slightly softer line that was put in there. Then I'm going to open the clipper a little more, go up a little higher. Until eventually everything should blend. I got this piece in the front here that's been glued down. Oh, yep. See, that didn't get cut because it was stuck to the head. So now that I've got this bottom area like balded out and blended, I'm going to take a one guard all the way open and I'm going to put in another guide. Now, the higher I go up the head and the longer I go on the guards, the longer I want my guides to be. And as I put in this guide, I'm going to take all the length from the top and hold it down with the comb. That way I can kind of push the clipper into the comb and it'll hold the hair still for me so I can get a cleaner cut and I can knock out more hair more easily. If I did this without combing it down, I would just be lifting up this hair instead of cutting it. Woo. Please cut. So as I'm doing this, instead of just flicking the clipper off the head like I was earlier, I'm more so kind of driving it up to the exact shape of the haircut that I want. So you want to visualize that shape. And as you're working toward this top corner of the head, you actually will feel the head roll away from the clipper inward. And so you kind of just take the clipper straight up. This is actually not even how I would approach this in a salon. This is like so much work for these clippers. This particular clipper that I use for this, the reason I like it is that it doesn't actually cut very fast. As you can see, it's having a really hard time mowing all this hair down. I wouldn't typically actually do things just like I'm doing here. I would take that off with clipper over comb or scissor over comb, but for the most part, in theory, this is how, if you had a clipper that could cut better, how you would go about this as far as putting in a guide and taking out a guide. Okay, that's good enough for now. I'll just get that out of my way. But now I can see I have another line. From where I had the clipper open with no guard to the clipper open with a one guard, there's a step in between. Some people refer to the zero guard as a cheater guard, and I don't care. I'll cheat. I'll do what I have to do. So now to take out that line, I'm using a zero guard. I'm going to start with the blade all the way closed, and just like I took out the first line, I'm going to just bump this area and lift the clipper off the head. I'm actually listening for when the clipper starts to cut. As soon as you can kind of hear and feel that little crunch in there, it's like a signal to flick it. Now I'm going to open the clipper a little more and go up a little bit higher. Close it again because I feel like I missed some hair here. I'm going to open it all the way. And so it kind of becomes a little bit of like second nature as far as opening and closing the clipper blade. You'll start to see these micro imperfections in the fade, and you just hyper focus on trying to make that coloring very uniform while keeping that shape in mind, that if I see a dark spot, and by working with the shape that I want, if I'm not taking out that dark spot, then I know that I have to go in and thin it out later. But if I catch myself to get that dark spot out, having to move inward toward like the inside of the haircut, I won't do it. I'll leave it for later, because as soon as you start going inward, you start putting holes in the haircut and you lose the shape. And so while it might blend out some of the lines, you're sacrificing the shape of your haircut to do that. One way that I might go about fixing something like that is to just point cut into it this way. So I'm taking out density without losing the actual shape of the haircut. Okay, let's see if I can give this length on top one more go here with a clipper that's not great for this. So this is a 2-guard open. Please cut, please cut. See, with this long hair on top, I actually can't even see what I'm cutting. I'm kind of just doing this off of like muscle memory, just like the feel. There we go. I don't know if you saw me in the camera do that, but I came around to the front here to get a close look at this to make sure the shape was actually right. After I go in with each guard and kind of put in my mechanical, robotical guide, I kind of go back and kind of free form, blend, and just kind of touch things up a little bit. Okay, so this weight line up here, I would take that off with clipper over comb, even if I were fading from the bottom to the top. But there you go. That's fading from the bottom to the top using guides. And again, I think that's the first way we should learn how to fade, because it teaches you what to look for at different areas on the head, and it makes it a lot easier to kind of visualize the end result as you're fading with any of these other techniques we're about to do. So this second technique we're going to do here is similar to the first one in that we're going to use guards and a weak clipper. I don't mean to hate on this clipper. It used to be better than it is now, but I actually really like that it cuts slowly. So for this second technique, we're going to be doing something very similar to the first one in that we're using a clipper with guards, and we're kind of putting guides in, but instead of cutting from the bottom up and bumping guides upward, putting in a guide, blending it out, putting in a guide, blending it out, I'm going to start on the top and go downward. And so with my 2-guard open, I'm going to come in here and kind of put in a hard guideline. Like I want a blunt line up here to begin with. I could try to blend this a little bit better at the top, but in this technique, this line up here is actually going to be my guide. So as soon as the head rolls in, right at this occipital bone, the clipper continues to go outward. So once I put in a pretty solid line there with the 2-guard open, I'm going to take the 2-guard and close it. So what I'm going to do now, instead of putting in another guideline and then blending it out, I'm going to just look at the shape I made up here, and I'm going to kind of follow that shape with the 2 closed and just take out a little bit of hair right beneath it. And sort of like before, listening for when the clipper cuts and just knocking out the little bit of hair that can be knocked out. I'm not going up quite as high as I did when I had the clipper open, but this area just below that line is going to be just barely incrementally shorter. So now I'm going to go to my 1-guard open, make sure I don't have little loose hairs on the scalp. And again, I'm going to follow that guideline, but even just a little bit lower this time, blending as I cut. So this technique actually works out to be really stinking fast once you get it down. As you're working down the head, if you see any dark spots or deviations, you kind of handle them right then and there as you're taking the length down. And so it's not two steps. You're not putting in a guide and then taking out a guide. You're not cutting every hair twice. You're cutting every hair one time. So now that I've done that with the clipper one guard open, I'm going to go one guard closed and go a little lower. When I first started doing this, I had a hard time controlling how long my blends ended up. And sometimes I would end up just fading the hair all the way down to here and there'd be like a tiny little bit of bald at the bottom. And after I got more comfortable with it, it was easier to be more aggressive with the shorter lengths and kind of just knock things down where they actually needed to be knocked down. Now that I'm done with my one, I'm going to go to a 0, start with it open, close it up. That ear is getting in the way again. Okay, at this point, no guard open. Half closed. And closed. Now, as I'm putting in this shortest part here that I can get with this clipper, I'm kind of leaving a hard line at the bottom. That'll help me when I go back with my trimmer to see exactly where the more or less bald area starts. So this line, as you can tell, echoes the shape of this line. So I kept this first guide in mind all the way down, and I just blended to the shape of that guide. Now the difference between a pretty good fade and a really good fade is like 15 extra minutes of going back to fine tune everything. When you glance at a fade that's good, you're like, yeah, it's good, right? But the more you look at it, the more you can find imperfections. And when you see these like really amazing fades online, usually what you're seeing is somebody who took 15 extra minutes of like hyper focusing on little tiny areas. What I'm doing right here to thin out some of these spots is just using the corner of the clipper, like turned sideways, just kind of straight up in the same direction that the hair is laying. And that'll kind of more or less texturize the hair and take a little bit of color out without taking off a bunch of length. So now that I'm done with that clipper, I'll come back in with the edger here, or if you have a balding clipper, that works even better. I had one, but I broke the teeth and I never did anything to fix it. Something that I learned, if you want to do fast work, you do everything you need to do with the one tool before you pick up another tool. So I will finish using that first clipper before I grab my trimmer. Just because it saves time that I don't have to be sitting and swapping tools. So this third technique I'm going to do entirely with clipper over comb. And as I go to do this, I switch clippers. I've gone to a more powerful clipper. This thing, one pass, the hair is cut. With the other clipper, I kind of have to keep going over it, which makes it easier to blend. With this, if I'm trying to blend and I make one wrong move, I've got a hole in my haircut. But with the clipper comb, I'm not as afraid of that because this gives me so much stinking control. So what I'm going to do here is get the hair laying in its kind of natural fall. I see some people clipper over comb where they bring the comb way out this way, but I don't want my haircut to be super long on top. I want it to be that shape right there. I think part of the reason that people overextend the direction of the comb here is that it gives them a little bit of safety, that they leave more length on top and they can go back and correct it later. But I'm just going to cut it right the first time, or hope to. So I'm going to put the end of the comb right on the widest part of the head, touching the head, and I'm going to bring the rest of it up to the angle I want to cut. Just take off whatever I can in a couple quick passes here. My clipper is open right now, meaning it's cutting a little bit longer. What I find working with the clipper open is that it creates a softer cut, and it also tends to mow hair a little bit better. I think because there's like bigger gaps between the teeth as you're doing that, so it just allows more hair to get in there and get cut. So what I'm going to do after I get this area kind of cut down to the width of the comb with the clipper open, to the shape that I want. Then I'm going to close the clipper, which will just get a little bit closer. I'm going to go back to this area right here, right where I first started my shape. And with the clipper closed, it's going to cut a little bit shorter. So on one hand, I'm kind of using the comb to ramp outward and cause the shorter length I'm creating now to blend into the longer length that I created a second ago. But at the same time, I'm also flicking the clipper off the comb the way that I would flick the clipper off the head while I was blending. Now I'm going to take the clipper wide open, and just below that area I just did, I'm going to do my best to blend with the clipper open into what I just did with the clipper closed using a comb. I'm doing that by sort of ghosting the movement out in the air of the shape that I want, which is really scary. It takes some muscle memory, but I find that if you use like some fluid movements, you can get it done much better. It's kind of like if you're trying to draw a nice, neat circle. If you just start from a standstill and go, you get like a wonky circle. But if you like do this with your hand a couple times and then you drop the pencil to the paper, you get a cleaner circle. And so I kind of feel if I'm doing this with the clipper, I get a much smoother shapes out of it. Okay, so now that I've done that with the clipper open, I'm going to close the clipper and do the same thing, a little bit lower. Much like when we were blending from the top down a minute ago. Maybe open it halfway here. All the way. Cool, I would call that about good enough. So now I can come back with my trimmer to do the bald area. I say bald, but the trimmer won't actually get bald. I need to go back with a shaver for that. So there's a little bit that could be cleaned up there. If I'm challenging myself to stay all clipper over comb for this, I would go to a thinner comb here to hit some of these dark areas. Just kind of use the corner of the clipper wide open. And it goes back to what I said, a great fade is when they stop and take the extra 5 or 15 minutes to hit every one of these dark areas with these different techniques, like using the corner of the clipper wide open, or clipper over comb, or point cutting with a scissor, whatever it takes. Okay, so the final technique we're going to do here is a scissor fade. Now this tends to be controversial and it kind of cracks me up. A lot of people will say, oh, that takes too long. I don't have time to do that with my clients. There are huge parts of the hair industry where time is money. Do a faster haircut equals cheap. Like, some people don't want a haircut that feels cheap, and if you're trying to rush everything, it feels cheap. If you're taking your time and sculpting everything with scissors, it feels expensive. And I will tell you this, I have never once in my career run late because I use scissors instead of clippers. And I will tell you this, every single person who says, oh, well, that's stupid to do with scissors, why not use clippers, it's faster. Everybody who says that hasn't done a scissor fade, I guarantee it, or they can't do it. So here, I'm gonna show you how to do it, and then give it a try, and if you still think it's stupid, then say so. But also, while I'm on the topic, you would never go look at like trick shots in basketball and say, well, that's stupid. Nobody would do a front flip off a trampoline and slam dunk in the middle of a game. That's not the point of trick shots. It's just taking the skill to an extreme. And to me, when somebody can fade with scissors, it's kind of like a trick shot. Like, very occasionally is it something that you actually have to do. But when you can do it, it's impressive. And to me, it just opens up the understanding of everything we've been talking about the shape and the shade. And if you can get that control with one little point of a manual scissor, then you know how to fade. You're not just monkey see, monkey doing what every cheap barber can do. There, I said it. Anyway, so to put in my first guide for the bald area, I'm just gonna take the blunt side of my blade and put it against the scalp and cut a line here, similar to that first guide that I put in on the opposite temple. So once I have a line there, now this will only work with hair that's long enough that it's laying down. If you try to do this on stubble, it doesn't really do anything. I'm gonna take that line and I'm gonna cut it basically a little bit wider. I'm just gonna cut the hair right beneath it and make the line thicker. And then I'm gonna do that again and make the line thicker. And I'm just gonna keep cutting that line thicker and thicker until eventually there's no hair there. So this part absolutely takes longer than just, jamming a clipper in there. But in the rest of this fade, you'll see where this actually makes up a lot of time. Because much like the clipper over comb fade or the fading to the top down, we're not going to be putting in guides and taking out guides. Like I did put in that one first guide, but that's going to be the only one. And everything else I do is going to be kind of blended as it goes. Now, when you're doing scissor over comb, it is ultimately important that you keep one blade still. If you can't do that, don't try this. Like if both of your blades are moving, you don't know where it's going to cut. And you want to make sure if one blade is still the entire time, you know where they cut? Right here, every time. If both blades move, do you know where they cut? I don't know either. They'll just cut somewhere in between the two blades. So if you come at this moving both blades, you don't even know what you're cutting. But if you can grab the hair, elevate it straight out off the head, keep that still blade still, and just pull your moving blade while you drive this up to create the shape you'd like to cut, it's a very quick and precise way to do this haircut. Now with this big fat comb, I'm not going to be able to get this hair short enough to blend into my bald area, but I'm going to go back and do that in a second. But as far as the shape up here, one pass and I'm pretty much going to be done. Because this hair is a bit longer, I'm using more coarse teeth on my comb. But as I start working with the shorter hair, I'm going to go with finer teeth and a smaller comb. I find that I tend to do this thing with my scissors. Like I keep saying, oh, keep the still blade still, but I kind of do this thing. And I think I do it subconsciously to create a little bit of texture. And also, my scissors need sharpening, and if you're closing them as you're pulling them, they cut a little bit better. So first pass there, clearly still have a line. So I'm going to come back with smaller teeth and scoop this out here. Go a little bit closer. So even though I prefer a big long scissor, typically when I'm doing scissor over comb, I just like to use the tip. I feel like I get more control that way. And also because the head is round, this 7-inch straight blade won't give me a uniform length across the head. It'll cut shorter where it's closest to the head and longer where it's further from the head. So by using just the tip, I can have more control over the lengths I'm creating. So now that this comb isn't thin enough to take out that weight line, I'm going to go to an even thinner comb. Did that take all day? I mean, it's not done yet, but I can probably do a scissor fade across the whole head in about 10 minutes. If I was doing that clipper over comb fade, I've done it before in 5 minutes for a decent fade, not a great fade. And then fading top down usually takes about 8 minutes. And when I fade to the bottom from the bottom to the top, like I did on the first side there, that takes 12 to 15 minutes. Okay, so now that I've gotten as short as I can go with this little itty bitty comb here, and I still have a little bit of a line, now I'm going to start working with the density of the hair, and I'm going to point cut in the same direction that the hair grows to just take some of that coloring out there. Now, if you didn't pick this up by looking at this part of the fade, or this technique here, the end result doesn't look like a clipper fade. It's not meant to. If you look at like Brad Pitt, Ryan Gosling, David Beckham even, you never see those guys with clean, blurry fades. They always have a little bit of, I guess, more of an organic look, you could say, where it looks a little bit kind of messy, kind of grown out even on day one. And that's sort of what you get with a scissor fade, is that slight imperfection just looks a little more earthy, looks a little more like less fresh and homogenized. And so it is definitely a look that some clients prefer and some clients don't prefer, but when it's right for them and you know how to do it, it's a beautiful thing. I don't think I took this side of the haircut as high as the other side. Okay, so even when I'm fading with scissors, I do like to finish it off with the trimmer just to get that clean bottom. Or, you know, mix and match. Sometimes you use a trimmer, sometimes you don't. Depends on the finish you want to go with. And here I'm kind of accidentally putting in a line. That's great. This is like a super old school barbering technique, to use your finger on your left hand to steady the blade. It's funny to me the amount of people who are like, I'm an old school barber. I'm like, you do fade with scissors? No. Well, you're not an old school barber. You just have a checkered floor. On some heads with a scissor fade, you can kind of just quickly and easily get a really clean result that looks almost like a clipper fade. On other heads, like this one admittedly is giving me some trouble right now, you have to work at it a little bit longer and keep refining things. There are times where I'll go in thinking I'm going to do a scissor fade, and then halfway through I'm like, all right, screw this, and I get out my clippers. But I'm going to just take a minute here to try to refine this and hopefully get a better look out of it. I don't want you guys to watch this and go, oh, scissor fades suck. Andrew sucks. I'll go back and talk about, oh, time is money, that scissor fade's taking so long. There are clients where if they smell that you're rushing, they feel like they got ripped off. But then there are clients where if I'm sitting and doing this to them and I'm like focused and I just keep like refining and refining, they feel like, oh, I got my money's worth. That guy really tried to do my hair good. And it's not an act. It's not like I'm like pretending to work harder than I need to. It's that, hair cutting it's like reduction sculpting. You're chopping things off and trying to create a final shape. So you just kind of keep like fine-tuning and fine-tuning until you get what you want. Truth be told, I almost never do a haircut where I feel like, okay, that's as good as it can perfectly be. Most of the time I get to a point where I'm like, okay, it's acceptable. And not that I'm half-assing it, but even like my absolute best efforts, they could always be better. There's always a little bit more refining that could be done. A lot of times too, if things are looking sloppy, you just got to stop and line it up. And that kind of brings back to life. What's killing me is to my eyes, I'm like, yeah, it's looking pretty good. And then I look at the camera and I'm like, oh, nope, there's a shadow. Right about here. I know any barbers watching this, they're just itching to grab their 0 guard and open up the clipper and fix that line, maybe a 1 guard. But I'm challenging myself. That's a thing, man. If you just do what you know works every time, you don't grow. You got to try new things and hard things and put yourself in situations that, maybe not on a paying client. Get a mannequin head and do what I'm doing. But you got to do things that are hard. Stick to them and make sure you get through it. It'll just make you better. I guarantee if you can sit here with a pair of scissors for long enough that you feel like you got a blurry fade, the next time you go to do a clipper fade, you'll be better at it. This area is just driving me nuts. You know what I think it might be? If I recall, I might have sprayed some enhancements on the corner of this mannequin head, so it's looking all dark over here. Well, that's good enough for me. I'll take it. Okay, so before I do the glamour shots and show you the end result of all these different techniques, I'm going to take the top and blend it in with vertical sections, much like you can find me doing in many of my haircut videos, which I will link in the description. So there we have it, 4 different ways to fade hair. And everybody's going to prefer their own method. I think ultimately if you try all of them, you will be a better hair cutter. If you can fade one way really, really, really well, but you can't fade any other way, to me that's like, you don't know hair. You know how to do a fade, but think of it like if you go to a neighborhood and you don't know the area, you know how to drive to exactly where you're going to, that's one thing. But if you know the area to where there's a road closed and you can go the back way, and you're just like, I know the area. That's kind of the difference here. It's like, okay, yeah, I can go this direct route to a fade, or hey, I can go any way I want and I'm going to end up with a fade. And so some ways are going to be better than others. You're going to find you favor some more than others, but ultimately, I think it's just, we all think we want to grow and be better at cutting hair, but if you're not challenging yourself to do something that might seem harder or take longer, or, why would I learn to fade another way? I can already fade really good the way that I fade. Well, because you want to be better, don't you? And if you can only do one thing one way, you're not good enough. There, I said it.